A nervous group of fathers didn't really know each other, and they were sitting in the maternity ward waiting room for the news. And the nurse comes out so excited, and she says to the first father, "I've got really good news for you. Twins." He said, "That is so amazing. I work for the Minnesota Twins." She comes to the next father. She says, "Great news for you. You've got triplets." He said, "That is strange. I work for 3M." She comes to the third father, and she says, "You won't believe this. I know you're going to be excited about this. You've got quadruplets." And he says, "Oh my God, I work for Four Seasons Hotel." And then she looks at the other father, and he's banging his head like this. And she goes, "What's the matter?" He says, "I work for 7-Up." Not the best news for a nervous father, right? Happy Father's Day to all of you. I would like a show of hands. How many of you were raised in a family with the perfect father? I see some hands. Amazing. How many of you were raised in raise your hands if you were raised in a family where your father wasn't quite perfect? How many of you were raised in a family without a father? How many of you were raised in a family where you knew who your father was, but he was absent from your lives? Yes. How many of you had a father who passed away when you were very young and you didn't get a chance to know your father? Yes. See, all of us come from different father relationships. Some of us knew our fathers and they were just outstanding. They were amazing. They walked on water. And some of us had fathers who really weren't present with us. Some of us never got to know our fathers. Either they passed away or they just weren't in our lives. Some people in this room don't even know who their father was. But I submit to you that there is one Father. We all have that Father. And so I want to talk to you today about that, the Father within. I was reading an article in the last year's issue, last year's issue of the Chicago Tribune about fatherhood, where several people wrote that Father's Day is outdated. And even fathers, some of them responded that they really don't feel that it's fair to have Mother's Day and Father's Day, that there should be a Parents' Day. And with the changing of the family in the world, the family dynamics, some families have 2 fathers and 2 mothers. Some families have fathers who play the mother role and mothers who play the father role. So in this article, there's a Father's Day resistance movement on social media. And it's a reminder of those who don't have any children, and yet this big made-up holiday for Mother's Day and Father's Day continues to loom large in our society. We spend a lot on those days. Hallmark makes a mint. And then there are those who have childhood wounds that still need healing. My father was not absent. I grew up in a 2-parent household, but my father suffered PTSD from World War II. Now, I didn't know that growing up. I never heard of PTSD. I just knew he drank a lot, and he didn't participate in a lot of the activities. In fact, I don't ever remember him attending anything at school. But the one thing I do know, from his level of understanding of how to be a parent, he loved us unconditionally. Now, that realization became more vivid to me after his death because I was more mature and able to put things into perspective. But I know that not everyone has that experience. And some of us still have childhood wounds that need to be healed. Someone in the article said, "Here comes another Father's Day. I wish I had known mine." And someone else said, why should we even celebrate a holiday that brings up so many negative memories? In the book of John, the 10th chapter, the 30th verse, we read, the Father and I are one. What does that mean? The Father and I are one. Does that mean my daddy, who's my daddy, is like me or I'm like him? In some ways. But it's deeper than that. That oneness with the Father is the oneness with our Father. And Charles Fillmore, co-founder of Unity, calls that first principle. The first principle of life, our very foundation, our very essence is based on this idea that there is one presence and one power in our lives and in the universe, God the good, omnipotent, meaning that all of it is good. It is good. So no matter what your father was like, how you described your father, or the absence of a father altogether, there is one presence and one power that overrides all of that, and it is good. Jesus said, I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. John 14:11. So when we look at who's our daddy, all we need to do is look in the mirror. Because I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. It's all about perception. Now, there in the Bible, which is Unity's textbook, there were some good fathers, and there were some not so good fathers. Now, I'm going to mention just one of those, who I thought was an excellent father, and that was Jacob. In Genesis, we read about Jacob. But the problem with Jacob, the real underlying problem, is Jacob favored a certain son. And by loving this son so much, he set him up for failure. And that was Joseph. He gave Joseph this beautiful coat. He lavished him with all the praise. And the other brothers became very jealous, to the point that they decided to get rid of Joseph. The good news is Joseph knew who he was. He knew who his daddy was. He knew that he was in the Father and the Father in him. And he continued to just use his gifts. It is said that comparison is the thief of joy. So when the other brothers compared themselves to the lack of love that they felt because Joseph was getting all the love, so they saw, that stole their joy. And when you lose your joy, you become disengaged from your Father. That sin word, you have a belief in the separation from you and your Father. And there's no such thing. You cannot be separated from the love of God. So the good news is, what others meant for bad and what Jacob unwittingly did, that could have meant great harm to Joseph, turned into something really good. Now, we have some everyday life experiences like that. I would not be standing here today and able to talk to you from my own experience were it not for growing up with an alcoholic father. I learned my best lessons watching, observing. That led me not to want to do those things. So when we can take the good from an experience, even though it might seem bad at the time, then like the story of Joseph and his brothers, it's all good. It's all good. How many of you have ever heard of Michael Orr? Football player. Played for the Tennessee Titans, the Baltimore Ravens. And Michael Orr was one of 12 children. His mother was on drugs, and he would be wandering around, scavenging for food. And he got the attention of a young lady And this young lady and her husband were fairly well-to-do, white family. Michael Orr is African-American. And she saw something in this big, burly, middle school, going to high school, homeless young man. And he really had nothing. He would sneak into the laundromat and see if somebody had their clothes. He'd wash his clothes in the sink, and if someone still had time on their dryer, he would sneak in and put his clothes in the dryer. He was just a kid. But Leanne and Sean Toohey saw something beyond the fact that this was a young man from the projects with no father and a mother who was extremely dysfunctional. And much to their friends and their neighbors and their society that they lived in that felt this was a dumb idea, they still brought him into their home. And they took him in as their own. Now, if you haven't seen the movie, you should watch it. It's a powerful story. Because it wasn't so much that they realized that what they saw was this young man who needed help. They saw something within him. He knew who his daddy was. Now, he'd never met his physical father. I presume his father was in prison, a friend of the mother's brother who was also incarcerated, and they shared the same cell. So he may or may not have ever really known him on a deeper level. But this young man had something in him. I vividly remember one scene at Thanksgiving. First time he'd been to the family's home for Thanksgiving. He sits down at the table. They're in the TV room watching the football game. And Michael's in the dining room sitting at the table by himself. And Leanne turns to look, and he bows his head, and he puts his hands together, and he says, "Grace." Now, you would presume that a young man with his background didn't have a lot of something that you would need to carry you through life, but that was an experience that changed the Toohey family. They all got up and went to the dining room and said a prayer and ate with him instead of sitting in the living room. He was teaching them where the Father is. I am in the Father, no matter what my circumstances, and the Father is in me. That's one of my favorite stories. Dr. Sonia Willis, one of our congregants, has just published a book, and you've heard me talk about it. It's called Touch, Breaking My Mother's Silence. Now, she had, like many of us, a dysfunctional family in a different sort of way. Her father was the nurturer. Her mother was the stoic intellectual who just drilled her every day of her life on what she should do and what she shouldn't do, and made her a great scholar and an excellent writer. But it was her father who inspired her to love unconditionally. It was her father who showed her what it means to say, no matter what your outer circumstances, you are in the Father, and the Father is in you. And so as her mother was on her deathbed, Sonia began to keep a journal, trying to connect with this woman who had been so distant from her, who had never even said, "I love you." And she realized that that father spirit in her, what her father had been teaching her, and he died in the 90s, but what he had left her with was how to be a loving, kind spirit, no matter how other people treat you, even your own mother. And before her mother took her last breath, the healing that took place is nothing short of miraculous. I see Sonia's here. You'll want to read this. I witnessed much of it toward the end of her mother's life. And to see how her father had groomed her to be the love, even if she didn't get it, it healed both of them. Our parents can only teach what they know. Many times people come to me, and I'm sure they come to Duke and Warren and other ministers and our chaplains, asking for prayer and guidance about relationships, and particularly those childhood wounds that seem to never heal. And the best thing we can tell them is, your parents did the best they could with what they knew. And you take the good from that, and you allow that to make you a better person. It doesn't matter if you have children or not. You can be the light in someone else's eyes. You can be the love that they long for. You can direct them in the right way. One of my favorite people to listen to and to read is Deepak Chopra. And in our Bible class, we've been watching the interview between Reverend Wendy Craig Purcell, Unity of San Diego, and Deepak Chopra, called The Third Jesus, based on his book by that title, The Christ We Cannot Ignore. And as you know, Unity's teachings, basic teachings, are about our wayshore, elder brother and teacher, not about Jesus, but about what Jesus came to teach us. And so I looked up what his children think about him. And Malika Chopra has written an article about her dad. She said that when she was growing up, he was not the Deepak then that he is today. He was studying to be a doctor, and he was probably following in his daddy's footsteps and being really stoic about studying and being the best and trying to make it. And they lived on the East Coast in Massachusetts, and everything was hectic. And he had no time for family, no time for the kids. He had to get through medical school. Very focused. I don't know how many of you have been that way, but I've been that way at times. And one day, when he was so stressed out, he didn't know what to do. He stopped by a place that had a sign that said meditation. He thought, well, I'm going to go in and see what this is about. He goes in and he starts learning to meditate. And in the next week, he was so calm and so peaceful and started to reinvent his life with his family, that he brought his family to the meditation group. And then he brought his brother and his wife. And pretty soon they would do this at home. But she said he didn't start out that way. When you know better, you do better. So, this article that I started out talking about goes on to say, perhaps we should, it's not that Father's Day is outdated, but perhaps we should rename it Fathering Day. And perhaps we should look at Mother's Day and name it Mothering Day. And if eventually, maybe we could just combine it all together and name it Parenting Day. And it has nothing to do with whether you had a good father or a not so good father, knew your father, he was there, he was absent, you never had children. It doesn't matter, because the Father is in me, and I am in the Father. So all you have to do, for those of you who are seeking to heal those childhood wounds, seeking ways to find the daddy that you've always wanted, is to look within yourself. You are the love that you seek. You are the truth that you want. You are the light of the world. You don't have to look anywhere else. And as Jerome's saying, God bless the child that's got its own. God bless all of you this Fathering Day. Go out and enjoy yourselves and remind yourself every day, you are in the Father and the Father is in you. Let us take that into meditation. Amen.